Hi there, just going to do a quick video to talk about adaptive sampling and why you want to use it. So for anyone who's used a different render other than Radeon ProRender, which is what we have here, you've probably used a setting called samples. And here in Radeon ProRender we have max samples here at 128, and there's also a min samples of 64. But most renders, you've probably noticed that if you put more samples in, you're going to get a less noisy image. So right now, this is actually using 64 samples for the viewport. You can see that here, but you get a kind of noisy image. And as you add more samples, it gets cleaner. So that's great and pretty straightforward, I think, for most users. But like imagine a scene, which probably happens a lot for your renders, where there's a certain area here in the scene with a lot of little detail on this dragon, and an area back here with not a lot of detail, and then probably the background here, which is going to have no detail at all. It's going to take a lot more samples to clean up the noise here in this area than it is in the background. So what adaptive sampling does is it basically tries to adaptively go and turn off the samples where it's not needed. So let me just start a render here, and you can kind of see what I'm saying. Now the as we, or let me do the fit here. So as the render starts, we have a lot of noise here, and then it cleans up pretty quickly. But if I actually go and look at the amount of noise, there's an AOV that you can enable in ProRender called Variance here. But if I actually go and look at that Variance AOV, you can see where the noise is in the image. And this was only 128 samples. You can see we're almost there already. But most of the noise here is on the edges of things or on this area of the dragon. So we only did 128 samples here, but you can already see that there's almost no noise here in the background of the image. And if we go and actually look at the image here, yeah, there's not very much noise here. A little more here and some right here. And I'll just zoom in a little bit so you can see that. But if we go back and look at the variance AOV, that pretty much reflects what we see in the background. There we go. So what adaptive sampling is actually doing is in these areas where it's black here and there's no variance in the noise, after a certain number of samples, it's just going to stop sampling there. And so basically that means you're going to get a faster render, because if you take something like Cycles, Cycles is a great renderer, but it doesn't do adaptive sampling in the default mode. I think there's an experimental mode where it has adaptive sampling, but most people don't have that available to them. So, we have 128 samples. It's going to do 128 samples in this, including this area over here, even if it's already converged to no noise. And those are just going to be wasted samples. If you could imagine an extreme case where you were doing, let's say that half of the image here. So we have an area of the image about right here that is that is the noisy part. So if we imagine that half of that image was converged after 64 samples, we could actually cut our render time down by a quarter if we were using adaptive sampling. So just to back up, how do we turn on adaptive sampling? Well, it's on by default, but the sort of threshold for how much noise do you want is right here. So if you set this to something very low, and then we'll go hit render, it's not going to change the AOV you see here, but it's just going to change at what point does it stop sending samples to these darker areas where there's less noise. So at a lower threshold, you're basically just saying the noise level where it cuts off these darker areas. And you can see that if I just go hit render again here. So you'll see there's a feedback here of how much of the adaptive sampling is done. When you set that threshold level lower, it obviously will take longer for that adaptive sampling level to converge there. So what are the caveats with adaptive sampling? There's really not any. You just have to be careful about what you set your noise threshold to. So what I actually like to do is I figure out what we want this threshold to be, and a good default is 0.005 or 0.05, excuse me. So you want to set that to something like that. Start from there. If you start feeling like your image is too noisy, you can actually set that to something lower. But then once that is done, you can set your max samples to something really high, and then it doesn't really matter because all the samples will be cut off by the time it gets to 100,024 samples. So my recommendation to people is set the noise threshold to the amount of noise you're comfortable with, and then set the max samples very high. You do see, you probably saw a little artifact in the background here with the black spots. That is a bug that comes up in only the current version of Blender, but we'll be fixing that very shortly. And it's only in the viewport when you use adaptive sampling in the viewport. So other than that, there's no real caveats. Just you need to rethink the way that you do things. And if you are using a renderer that doesn't have adaptive sampling, this could be a huge way for you to save render time. So thanks again, and look forward to seeing all the cool renders that you do with Radeon ProRender. Thanks.